This year at Philosophy Portal, we will be leading a full course offering seminars on the early writings of Karl Marx. This course will be called Early Marx 101. The course is open, meaning you can join at any time. To get involved, visit philosophyportal.online. What I'm trying to do in this series is offer basically an introduction to the core books that we're going to be covering in the course, Early Marx 101. And here we're obviously starting with the critique of the philosophy of right, but I'm going to be making basically two videos covering the introduction. In part one, I'm going to be focusing on how Marx thinks about religion in the critique of the philosophy of right. And in the second part, I'm going to be thinking about how Marx is thinking about politics in the critique of the philosophy of right before actually getting into the main book, which will be the primary course materials. And there's something I think really interesting about even the start of this project, namely with the critique of the philosophy of right. We're dealing with a book where the introduction was actually the only materials published during Marx's own lifetime in the 19th century. And it wasn't until the first half of the 20th century in the 1920s, actually after the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the entire book, The Critique of the Philosophy of Right, was released. So I think that analyzing in the course the full book is going to give a remarkable window into Marx's relationship to Hegel and specifically diving into an aspect of Marx's relationship to Hegel, which nobody actually saw in the 19th century because this material wasn't released. So there's a huge opportunity here. And I think on another side, I think that for anyone who's been following Philosophy Portal will know a lot of our course materials have been focused on Hegel. We've done courses on the phenomenology of spirit. We've done courses on the science of logic. We've done course on the philosophy of right. And actually, we did our last course on Hegel last year on the philosophy of right. So there's a huge opportunity here to analyze Marx, and another sort of motivation for me as a philosopher, another motivation for me as a thinker, has been this tension between Hegel and Marx, and perhaps a story that you may have heard before from me. But before I started getting into philosophy explicitly and directly, and specifically diving deep into the primary source materials of Hegel, I went through a prolonged phase of identification as a Marxist. I went through a prolonged phase of identification as a communist without having read the primary source materials of Marx, but of course, having exposed myself to many thinkers who were trying to revive Marxism during, let's say, the rise of the millennial left. I'm thinking about Alain Badiou, I'm thinking about Slavoj Žižek, I'm thinking about David Graeber, I'm thinking about many other prominent Marxists in, let's say, the 2010s. And I think that the path that led me down was actually something I would call a unreflective activism, and basically here taking the starting point for Philosophy Portal and the reason why we started with Hegel and the reason why we started with specifically Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is learning about what it takes, what are the conditions of possibility to actually cultivate inside oneself philosophical mind before one approaches problems of political economy. So there's that kind of meta process that has been underlying and motivating the work at Philosophy Portal. And so there's a real huge opportunity here, I feel, both personally and collectively at Philosophy Portal to dive into Marx's work from the point of view of a real philosophical cognition. And already I'm getting interesting ideas. For those of you who have taken courses at Philosophy Portal, you might know that the way I think about Hegel's works in regards to the aforementioned phenomenology of spirit, science of logic, and philosophy of right is that those books can kind of be categorized using Lacan's triad of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. I think about the phenomenology of spirit as the imaginary in the sense of traversing the fantasy, in the sense of learning about the different phases and negativities that one goes to, again, towards cultivating philosophical cognition. I think, and that was actually explicitly written by Hegel as a precondition for entering the logic. So, entering the logic would be the equivalent of the symbolic in the sense of we are learning about a modernist formulation of logic, and that modernist formulation of logic is trying to accommodate the scientific universe. There is a trend in German idealism that what is going on in German idealism is trying to rise or raise philosophy through self reflection to the level of a science, what Hegel will call the philosophical sciences. And this is a kind of sublation of Aristotle. This is a kind of sublation of Plato as well, that what Hegel is trying to do is bring the logic of the ancient world to meet the standards of the modern world and the scientific universe. And again, so I'm thinking about the science of logic as kind of Hegel's symbolic phase. And then all of that is really bringing Hegel to politics in the philosophy of right and really thinking about the modern state. And of course, Kant and Hegel are both responding to the bourgeois revolutions of 1789 as well as 1776, if we want to expand our scope beyond Europe towards also America, which I think is fair and which I think only enhances our capacities for analysis here. That we're dealing with the real when we're dealing with politics. We're dealing with world spirit. We're dealing with absolute spirit in its most concrete form. And, Hegel has a structure, Hegel has a model, a dialectical model, of course, that he is building in regards to family, in regards to community, in regards to state. And throughout the course last year, what we were trying to do is see insofar as that dialectical model still applies, or insofar as that dialectical model breaks down in its own historicity in our time, basically. And well, if you're interested in that, there are materials freely available on YouTube where I go into the philosophy of right, but there's also, of course, the full course, which you can also access at Philosophy Portal. So just giving that background, because that background is necessary to understand now Philosophy Portal going into the critique of the philosophy of right with Marx. And what's interesting to me in now building this course on the early Marx and early Marx's writings is that it seems obvious to me that Marx's thought is dripping in Hegelianism. It is conceptually Hegelian. And at the same time, Marx is focused on, as is common knowledge, inverting, flipping, turning Hegel on his head, which is the common textbook interpretation of what Marx is doing. And what's even more interesting to me is where he's doing it. He's doing it not in the phenomenology of spirit or the science of logic necessarily, although I take it that Marx does have issues with certain aspects of Hegel's phenomenology and certain aspects of Hegel's logic, but he's not writing a full book like he's doing here with the critique of the philosophy of right. So Marx is zeroing in on the real in Hegel. Marx is zeroing in on the real of politics, world spirit, which of course makes sense. We don't think about Marx actually as a typical philosopher. We think about Marx as more a political or an economic thinker. I've also heard Marxists say that he's more of an economic thinker, of course, referring here to the capital, and actually that there's not really a deep political theory in Marx here, pointing more towards the mysteries and some might say the impossibilities of the Marxist project in regards to dictatorship of the proletariat and so forth, the dialectical transition from capitalism to socialism to communism and so forth. So I just want to say here that setting the stage for Philosophy Portal, having covered in depth Hegel's philosophical attempt to sublate ancient philosophy towards the task of modernity, and here Marx flipping, inverting, playing with Hegel, as is well known, specifically at this level of the real of politics and world history. So that will be, at least from a teaching, from my perspective going into this work, how I will be trying to think with Marx. As I mentioned, this video will be a opening introduction, a part one of an introduction to the critique of the philosophy of right. We will be specifically focusing on how Marx conceives of religion and theology. There are, and what is remarkable in not only Marx, but in the German idealist tradition, that there is a tremendous density and infamy to the prefaces and the introductions of the great texts that are produced by this tradition. So, famously, the preface of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, the preface of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, these prefaces and introductions have some of the most well-known phrases and passages and most well-cited, well-quoted aspects of their work appear actually in the introductions and the prefaces. And I think it's the same here for the critique of the philosophy of right in Marx. There are some tremendously famous passages that we find in the opening of this text. And, also want to reiterate that the entire book was actually not even published in the 19th century. So when we are thinking about Marx's perspective on the critique of the philosophy of right, really we are talking about the introduction. And so part of the course and part of the deepening of this investigation will be to flesh out actually how Marx is struggling with Hegel's system ultimately of the family, the community, the state, how Hegel understands the relationships between these terms, specifically a critique of how Hegel's thinking about monarchy, how Hegel's thinking about the idea, how Hegel is a philosopher, and how philosophy itself is problematic on the level of politics and let's say world history and let's say actual lived experience of human beings and so forth. So all of that to say that ultimately when we're going into the introduction of the critique of the philosophy of right, we will be going over many aspects of Marx's thought, which are actually well known, which are actually well cited, which are actually common points of reference for anyone, whether you are a scholar of Marx, whether you identify as a Marxist, or whether you are someone actually that is a deep critic of Marx and actually someone who's studying Marx because actually you think Marx is a dead end, or you think Marx is dangerous, or you think Marx is somehow something that needs to be learned only in an antagonistic relationship so that you can, as it were, defend yourself against Marxist thought or communist thought. So I just want to sort of, again, preface that before we go into some of the materials that we'll find in the opening of the critique of the philosophy of right, specifically on the topic of religion and theology. Probably you already have an idea of what we might encounter here. So opening up this text, what we find already is that Marx opens the critique of the philosophy of right with the idea that not only is the criticism of religion the prerequisite of all criticism, but that this prerequisite was completed, quote unquote, in Germany. And specifically here, this is a explicit, if not an exclusive reference to the German idealist project, and perhaps specifically here the work of the Kantian critique, which of course introduces the transcendental philosophy. And from my reading of Hegel, as well as my reading of other philosophers and the entire modernist tradition, we would not be overstating it to suggest that the Kantian project, the Kantian critique, the transcendental philosophy, is actually the core of the German idealist project. Kant is the father of the German idealist project, and many of the ideas about religion specifically that come out of German idealism are part of this building within the Kantian critique, building within the transcendental philosophy. And I've made the point in the Christian atheism course, which is available at Philosophy Portal, that actually the entire modernist philosophical project is a kind of death of God theology. It's a kind of grappling with, in philosophical terms, the death of the universal being, the death of the external referent, whether that's a Spinozan substance, whether that's a Platonic idea, just to use some common points of reference there that everyone will have some understanding of, Parmenidean being, that there is a new relationship to philosophy which is opening up with Kant, specifically with the transcendental turn. Here I'm referring to transcendental apperception, the a priori categories, this reflexive, self-reflexive move where one is less sure, uncertain, or even explicitly limited in regards to how much one can know about external being because of the structure of our mind being a fundamental starting point for the way in which we are thinking about the world. Of course, this is also something that Hegel will take up in the phenomenology of spirit as a starting point, starting with cognition, starting with sense certainty, and so forth. The main point here is that Marx is also building within this tradition, and he's building within his critique of religion, basically a deepening of the work that has gone on in German idealism. And so also saying that the critique of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism, he's saying, okay, this starting point, critiquing religion, critiquing Christianity specifically, of course, in the German context, the critique of Catholicism, the critique that was the ground, as we'll find, of the Protestant Reformation, Luther, of course. All of this is the theological seed form for what makes German idealism possible. All of this is the theological seed form for what makes Marx possible. And I think that that point is important to labor on, because there is still this ambiguity about Marxism and religion, which is not at all resolved. And actually, in terms of the performative contradictions and the social contradictions that we can find as Marxist intellectuals in general, we can still feel that there is this deep ambiguity about how to relate to the problems of socialism, the problems of communism, and the reality of religion and the persistence of religion. One might even say the indestructibility of religion, which is a perspective that I've sort of cultivated in the reading of the difference between Freud and Lacan, that there is a type of indestructibility in religion, which I feel like Lacan is identifying and which Freud is perhaps either not aware of or struggling with in a different way than certainly Lacan is. But that is beyond the point. The point here is that Marx is working within this sort of German idealist tradition, which has, he thinks, completed the critique of religion, which perhaps was started in the Protestant Reformation, and you could say has now reached its philosophical form in the German idealist camp and thought tradition. And of course, perhaps Marx is also referring to the young Hegelians and perhaps some of the tensions that are emerging among young Hegelians with religion and politics and so forth. And so this specifically manifests in the opening of the Critique of the Philosophy of Right, with Marx pinpointing a refutation of heavenly speech. And he's also, I think, getting into the function of heavenly speech. We can think about every Sunday going to church and hearing the pastor or the priest talk basically from the point of view of our Father who art in heaven. speaking from the perspective of the transcendental, speaking as a mediator or a connection to the perfect heavenly reality, to give some hope, to give some direction, to give some transcendental connection, which without, Marx is quick to point out, what we are left with is profane existence of error. And he says specifically that this profane existence of error is compromised when the heavenly speech is refuted. So we get this, I think, very important initial distinction between, on the one hand, why is the heavenly speech there for Marx? Well, it's there because it is helping us cope with, it's a cope, and we'll develop this further as we get into, of course, the opium, religion as an opiate. Well, the heavenly speech is a cope for our inability, or our perhaps choice not to confront the profane existence of error and everything that we're going to find there. And of course, that is already, for Marx, placing the seed idea that what we are struggling with, and the challenge before us, is to move beyond, let's say, the transcendental illusions of the heavenly speech, of even the Father, here again invoking death of God theology, and towards the political, towards the secular, towards the world, in all of its profanity, in all of its error, in all of the mistakes that we may find in ourselves and the other in dealing with this world. So that is compromised. And so basically, we are dealing with a problem which I do think also reappears and repeats itself in Freudian psychoanalysis, with the illusions of religion on the one hand, and on the other hand, the bare reality, the profane existence, the coping with reality. And I think that most standard interpretations of Freud's relationship to religion would be something like, let's overcome the childish illusions of religion, let's enter into a type of developmental maturation in the scientific universe where we basically, bite the bullet, we overcome the pleasure principle, and we deal with reality on its own terms. That is basically what maturation and growing up is facing reality on its own terms without the transcendental illusions of religion. Now, that becomes, of course, complicated in theory with, of course, I don't know if Hegel would take the same point of view. In fact, I would argue that Hegel wouldn't take exactly that point of view. I don't think Lacan would necessarily take that point of view, and certainly someone like Slavoj Žižek wouldn't necessarily take that point of view, although there is a deep truth in that point of view that we need to take on board. And it's a deep truth that we still need to struggle with. I'm more pointing towards here the ambiguity in the way in which we think about the status of religion and the place of death of God theology in ultimately where we're going to be heading is, of course, the political. Now, what I think is most important in regards to what Marx is offering here as his starting point is that I think he is actually relying on certain resources that one can find within Hegel's phenomenology and logic, which is to help us precisely with error, to help us precisely with flaw or mistake, that that actually conventionally, traditionally, we might think that error, flaw, mistake, actually this is what Spinoza would think, that error, flaw, and mistake is actually something that might actually take us further away from the truth, that might take us further away from the perfect Father in heaven. But rather, what Marx is saying, and I do think that this is again reflected in Hegel's phenomenology most explicitly, that actually the fear of error, the fear of the profane existence of error, to cover that over with heavenly speech, is actually fear of the truth itself. So there is obviously a tremendous irony in that what conventionally people have thought of as the most true, what conventionally people have thought of as the most high, what people have thought of as the ultimate reality is actually a way to defend oneself from quote unquote the ultimate reality, which one can find in error, which one can find in flaw, which one can find in mistakes, which is, of course, a quote unquote bitter pill to swallow. So ultimately, here, what Marx is saying is that once we have overcome the fear of the death of God, and we are capable of thinking in and with the profane existence of error, we are closer and not further from the truth. And I think that is that is really the core idea, that actually in this tradition that I've been speaking to and speaking with, there is a general agreement. I think there is a broad understanding that this is basically the path to follow here. And of course, in Marx's context, this will lead him down the rabbit hole of how this brings us all to the world historical struggle of political economy, where we find nothing but the errors of profane existence. So Marx continues his critique of religion by suggesting that, as opposed to confronting the error-riddled nature of profane existence and the resulting impotence and weakness of our condition, that we sought a Superman in the fantastic reality of heaven. Now, Marx does not necessarily develop the language of human impotence and human weakness. In fact, Marx does have a model of consciousness and self-consciousness, which does seem to point towards our progressive empowerment beyond ultimately capitalism, and in the context of a socialist and a communist reality, which perhaps we can find in the 21st century to be either unbelievable or difficult to grapple with, especially if we are fully taking on board psychoanalysis, and especially if we are fully taking on board the unconscious, and specifically here thinking about the Lacanian insistence on impotence and weakness of our starting condition, and the impotence and weakness where actually we cannot overcome that impotence and weakness, but actually need to embrace that impotence and weakness. I'm also thinking about the works of someone like Todd McGowan, who's developing this idea, very, I think, Zizkian in its orientation, of embracing alienation, which is a theme in Marx which is approached differently traditionally, in the sense of alienation is something that needs to be overcome and can be overcome in socialism and can be overcome in communism, that alienation is experienced not because of our bodily impotence necessarily, but because of our socioeconomic conditions and so forth. So again, I really do want to highlight and bring to the surface some of these tensions that I perceive, because I hope it will help us think through and with the early Marx and beyond. But what Marx is emphasizing is that we sought a Superman in the images of heaven, and one can infer that the condition of possibility for our desire to seek a Superman in heaven is because we do not feel like a Superman. And this language also points towards an obvious connection with Nietzsche, in the sense that Nietzsche is also very much a Marxist in his spirit, in not necessarily the political economy completely, as of course thinkers like Daniel Tutt will point out, but that Marx is a Nietzschean in the sense that there is this striving for an empowerment for Marx, a very deep social empowerment, which is replacing and trying to replace what we previously imagined would be the case in a heavenly reality, in a Christian metaphysics, in a afterlife, ultimately, and trying to bring that to the earth. And there's something very Nietzschean about that. Now, Nietzsche, of course, is going to be developing not a political economic model of socialism or communism, but he is going to be pointing towards this idea of the overman as this self-overcoming, as this overcoming, I think, of the human condition itself. But, that also takes us far afield. Again, just want to situate the way I am thinking about this enormous constellation of philosophical thought that we call modern philosophy, in order to position the way Marx specifically here is situated in this field. So, the way I would interpret what Marx is saying here, and again, this might not be the way Marx is interpreting what Marx is writing here, but the way I would interpret this is that the human species feels impotent in relationship to the reality of the world, and the gap between the reality of the world and our condition is actually the ontological structure in which we create fantasies that help us cope with the situation. These fantasies take the form of religion. We create religion. We'll get to that. Marx is certainly of the mind that we create religion as opposed to, say, God creating us in a sense. Here Marx taking on board the ideas of evolution. It's well known, of course, Marx is reading Darwin. Marx is aware of Darwin. Marx is, of course, this is before Darwin, but he is evolutionary in his thinking. And of course, evolutionary thought is itself percolating, is itself, a part of the intellectual milieus in which Marx is thinking and writing. But ultimately here, what Marx is saying is that religion is a coping mechanism for human weakness. And of course, where he is attributing the problems of that weakness is in society, is in the state. And we will get deeper into that specifically. And there is a optimism in Marx that even though there is a need for disillusionment, even though there is a need to overcome this seeking of a Superman in heaven and this heavenly speech, which is helping us deal with the profane existence of reality, that we still must seek our true reality, that we still must seek a better world. And that Marx, perhaps different from Nietzsche, seems to imply that this true reality is not only a socialist reality, but is a human reality, but is a deeply good thing and is a beautiful thing. So there is a way in which the good, the true, the beautiful, of course, the Platonic categories are secularized. They are understood to be of this earth. They are understood to be immanent to the historical process, and that immanent critique internal to our socio-historical reality is something that is ultimately going to bring us towards a good, true, beautiful reality. So there is that dimension of things which invokes a type of teleology, which invokes a type of replacement of any supernatural orientation with a more naturalistic orientation and a immanent historical orientation. So again, there's lots of connections here, and there's a lot of place to play. There's a lot of relationship between Marx, traditional Christianity, Marx, German idealism, Marx, psychoanalysis, Marx, Nietzsche. There's all of these thinkers, which I think thought is in this kind of meta historical conversation that we need to continue to build, while recognizing the ambiguity of the tensions that we find between all of these thinkers and traditions. So here to reiterate the point that I mentioned briefly previously, that Marx is on the side of man is creating religion. By man, we could say, and we will say moving forward, that when Marx is talking in this way, he is thinking about society. He is thinking that the state, the society, the social body of man makes religion. And that in religion we find the collective self-consciousness and the collective self-esteem of man. You could almost say, like, because we are in the nightmare of history, that religion is a kind of symptom of the nightmare of history, that religion is kind of an imagistic covering, an imaginary layer, a protective sphere or bubble, to use language that might be invoked by someone like the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, that there is a kind of cocoon, even an infantilization protective layer that man as society is making, and that this understanding of religion would lead one to the potential hypothesis that, well, could society be structured other, to the point where this religious dimension is no longer needed, that not only is God not eternal, and religion is reflecting this eternal true reality outside of us or beyond us, but actually that religion is historical and evolutionary, that religion is something that is created within history, and that religion is created within an evolutionary process where it is responding to real historical needs and desires of the human species, but nevertheless something that, if those conditions, those historical conditions, were different, which is where Marx will like us to think, that perhaps religion will wither away, perhaps not dissimilar to the way Marx will start to theorize the way in which he thinks the state might wither away one day in the right conditions. So ultimately, here saying that religion does not make man, we could say here that God did not create humans, that he is getting rid or jettisoning any ontological status of the supernatural, let's say. So another important point is Marx is saying that religion is specifically here for people, for self-consciousness, who has either not yet won himself. Here we could think about the phenomenological unfolding of a developmental dialectic, that someone has not yet come to a deep enough layer of their own self-consciousness. Or, on the other hand, someone who has already lost himself. So there is two sides to this coin. There is religion for someone who does not yet know himself. I'm thinking here about people who particularly might have been in, quote unquote, indoctrinated or raised in a religious environment and have never been encouraged to explore their own self-relation. So I think this is something that I've heard, for example, Jim Palmer, who is a deconstructive theologian, speak about, that when one is raised in a religious environment, that when one's life and when one's entire spiritual aroma is covered in a religious cultus, a religious community, that one never actually develops a self-relationship to oneself, so one has not won him or herself. And so there is a way in which Hegel's phenomenology tries to deal with that, in regards to there is a coming to self-realization, there is a coming to self-reflection, which requires a immanent critique and transcendence of the religious illusion. On the other hand, the having lost himself could be more on the level of experiencing deep life negativities, either, at a certain stage of life or maybe later on in life, where one starts to rely on religion as a kind of existential crutch, where one starts to rely on religion in order to deal with either the pains of mortality or the pains of social exclusion or the pains of not realizing oneself in the way one has dreamed, or where one's entire life project has collapsed. At least I have some safe place where I have some opiate to bear, to, again, cope, to keep going on. So there is this at play as well. Now, again, I want to emphasize, I've already emphasized that when Marx is talking about man, he's talking about the world of man. He's saying explicitly man is the world of man, and he is saying that man is state, man is society, man is a social being. We are talking about man, we're talking about social being, we're talking about society, we're talking about this on the largest scales, religion, but also, of course, politics, world state, nation states, the interrelationships between states, which is, of course, here again, we can continue to work with Hegel's model in the philosophy of right, insofar as Hegel is thinking about absolute spirit. Hegel is thinking about world spirit on that level. He is thinking about it on the level of ultimately the interrelations between states, the impossibility of a world state, the impossibility of world peace, the inevitable tensions, conflicts, antagonisms that arise between states. This is man. This is the world of man. And one can see why Marx would think that religion in this context, that man in this historical tunnel, would need to produce something like religion as what he calls a quote unquote inverted consciousness of this world. This is another Hegelian term that Marx is using. And to think about religion as an inverted consciousness of the world, he's saying it's the opposite. It's that the religious world is the heavenly world. Earth is not heaven. That in this world we are mortal, in heaven we are presumably immortal. In this world we are born, we die. In the heavenly world we presumably are not born and do not die. In this world we are not with God. In the heavenly world we are with God. So there is an opposite character to this world. And so again, one might conclude that Marx is thinking about this world of man, this state, the world of states and societies, as something that necessarily needs to produce religion in order to cope with war, in order to cope with conflict, in order to cope with death, in order to cope with disease, in order to cope with just the social tensions that characterize and riddle the social body and a social life. Now, consequently, Marx is seeing religion as a kind of general theory. When we think about, and I have a kind of pet peeve, for example, with more scientifically inclined thinkers who try to develop a general or a theory of everything, because I feel like what they're doing is oftentimes kind of trying to create their own religion. And I'm just like, well, see where that takes you. But in general, I do agree with what Marx is saying, is that religions are already general theories of the world. He calls religions the logic in their popular form. So religion is for the masses. Religion is for what Marx will see as the proletariat, of course. And here, this is so important to understand because, of course, Marx is trying to speak to that population. Marx is trying to speak to popular form. In fact, the Marxist project makes no sense unless one can speak to the popular form. Because without the workers, without the lower classes, which is the large majority of human beings, understanding the illusion of religion, desiring to overcome the illusion of religion, and towards taking control of the means of production, towards a different social order, then the entire project isn't going to work. So he's saying here that religion as a universal consolation and justification is not just wrong, it is actually an obstacle to emancipation. So again, there's an irony where most people think that religion is the key to their emancipation. Marx is saying, no, actually, this is what is blocking possible emancipation. And so this ambiguity, this tension is something that also needs deeper attention and analysis, insofar as, well, one could say that, well, without religion, the popular project that Marx is proposing didn't actually happen, that we've actually already run the experiment, that what we found is that we just fall into worse political projects, tyrannical, fascistic, totalitarian, however we want to think about that, or that we just simply fall into an empty hedonism, where we just fall into an empty nihilism, that without religion, we have no capacity to transcend ourselves. So, do we need actually a more nuanced model of the relationship between religion and politics? And is Marx here too quickly trying to throw away the baby with the bathwater? Is he, on the other hand, expecting too much from the people? Is he expecting too much from the working class? That might be another theme that we might want to stay with, we might want to continue exploring. However, it's clear that for Marx, religion is a phantasmatic screen. It is, again, an illusory screen, which is actually an obstacle to human essence and true reality, where Marx sees true reality as the realization of human essence in this world, where Marx sees the true reality of human essence in a ultimately political, socialist, democratic project which is oriented towards something of a social order beyond capitalism. So he states explicitly that the struggle against religion is therefore indirectly the struggle against that world whose spiritual aroma is religion. There is a distinctly deconstructive, negative relationship to religion, that we actually need to overcome religion. And the reason why we need to overcome religion is because that is a necessary precondition for a political project that could actually realize the masses, the popular form. So again, I think what's most important here to take away is that Marx is writing to and for the popular form. He is, in that sense, distinct from Hegel. He is distinct from Kant. He is distinct from, one could argue, most philosophers, in the sense that most philosophers are perhaps writing in a way and to an audience that is not necessarily everyone, that there is an idea that actually philosophy is not for the many, that philosophy is for the few, and that has a distinct exclusive character to it, which of course religion doesn't have. Religion is for the masses. Religion is for everyone. And in that sense, Marx is, again, not so much a philosopher as, and of course he is a economist of a sort, he is a political thinker, of course, but the way in which Marx is stepping on theological terrain is perhaps necessarily understated oftentimes, that actually, and is Marx aware of the degree to which his project is theological in essence, or how is Marx understanding his role as modernist theologian in a political context, secular theologian in a political context? That's another thing that perhaps needs to be more deeply discussed and reflected upon. So here we come to very famous reflections by Marx, and often quoted reflections by Marx, where he is expressing this kind of dual nature. He is aware and, states explicitly, look, religious suffering is real. It is it is an expression of real suffering. This inverted world that we're creating, this cocoon, this imagistic covering that we're creating, it's coming from a real suffering. It's coming from the nightmare of history. It is a protest against that real suffering. He just thinks that it's a misguided protest. He just thinks it's a protest that needs to be put elsewhere. So he'll say, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, suggesting that we are oppressed creatures. He will say, religion is the heart of a heartless world, suggesting that we live in a heartless world. He will say that religion is the soul of a soulless condition, suggesting that we do live in soulless conditions, and it is that context where he'll call religion an opium. So again, he is suggesting that religion is an opium, it's a copium that is, justified in a certain sense. There's a popular logic to it, Marx gets it. He gets why we might go to it. He might get why we need it, but he's also here to say that the absolution of religion as the what he'll call the illusory happiness of the people here, opium, an illusory happiness, an opiate of happiness, is the demand for their real happiness. And for real happiness, Marx is definitely going to be pointing, of course, in a political, in a secular, in an earthly direction. So here, I think we get actually a distinction which I want to highlight between what I think is a real difference between Marx and Freud, which is that Marx is, and here saying that Marx is much more optimistic than Freud. Marx is much more, Marx thinks that the possibilities for human empowerment and self-realization seem to me to be higher than the way Freud's thinking about it. So Marx is basically saying we cannot just critique religion. And maybe this is also a critique of the German idealists in the sense of a critical project, like that immanent critique is not for just endless critique. That immanent critique is not just so we get rid of religion and then we're just left with nothing. He is saying, no, we have to critique religion. We have to remove this phantasmatic chain and this phantasmatic consolation in order so that we can really live. So in order so that we can create a world which ultimately, when he says the criticism of religion disillusions man so he can regain his senses, and in regained senses he can move around himself as his own true son, what he's saying there is a socialist world. When he's talking about man, when he's talking about regaining our senses and revolving around ourself as our own true son, he's not talking about this in a purely liberal individualistic way. Although, of course, I think that there's good reason to suggest that Marx is sublating liberalism, and he's not just trying to, he's not illiberal in a way. So I think that ultimately what's going on here is that he's talking about the collective body of humanity. He's talking about a socialist political reality where revolving around ourself as our own true son means that we build a socialist reality. And so, this political dimension is something that is I think well known. It's not that it's not there in Freud. And to be fair to Freud, well, Freud's not a political thinker necessarily. Freud is a psychoanalytic thinker. Now, undeniably, Freud is diving into social issues. Undeniably, Freud is, from a very early period of his career, interested in anthropology. He is interested in sociology. He is interested in theology. But Freud is a psychoanalyst. And so I think that, where Marx's ideas certainly take us is in a tension with the Freudian project, and at the same time, a productive tension with the Freudian project in this way. So also, the way we are going to be building towards the close of this first part of the introduction to the critique of the philosophy of right is that Marx, and perhaps this brings us full circle in a certain way to how we started with Marx clearly building within the German idealist tradition, is that he is also trying to find his perspective on how to relate to philosophy. What is the role of philosophy? I think Marx is asking himself in this situation, and I think he gives us actually a pretty clear answer, which is that once the other world of truth has vanished, and we must establish the truth of this world, that is, once the religious theological world of truth has vanished, and we work towards establishing the truth of this world, well, philosophy's task in service of history, and in a Hegelian sense, of course, we're thinking about philosophy historically. Well, the task of philosophy is to also unmask the unholy forms of self-estrangement. So basically, Marx is saying after the holy forms of self-estrangement have been unmasked, that is, the religious forms of self-estrangement have been unmasked, then we still have the task of unmasking the unholy forms. And I think that this is so crucial because, and this has also helped me understand why I gravitate towards philosophy, because when we live in a culture without religion, we do fall, at least in our time, into a type of liberal hedonism, which I think you could call the unholy forms. And so philosophy here is indispensable. Philosophy, as the unmasking of the unholy forms, let's say the liberal hedonistic forms, is actually a necessary constitutive part of ultimately the dialectical historical project of building socialism and pointing towards a socialist reality. So that's ultimately how Marx is thinking about philosophy, and I think that that's actually a really good way to think about philosophy. I like the way Marx is thinking there. So ultimately, and to bring us towards a conclusion of the first part of the introduction towards the critique of the philosophy of right, what we're dealing with here is a general perspective that Marx is starting with, which is to critique heaven, to critique religion, to critique theology, is to at the one time move from a history covered in mythology towards a history that is philosophical. And again, he is here clearly embedding his thought in the tradition of German idealism. The critique of religion has been the prerequisite for all other criticisms, that critique of religion has been completed in Germany. That means that the critique has been completed in a combination of the Protestant Reformation and the German idealist tradition, and that now the task before us is the critique of earth, the critique of law, the critique of politics, and that this critique is the task of modern philosophy. And you could ask yourself, well, has modern philosophy moved in that direction? And I think that by and large, philosophy has moved in that direction, that philosophy has become a critique of the earth, a critique of law, critique of politics, and that continues. Perhaps what needs to be emphasized, however, is the popular form of that philosophy, that perhaps that's what's missing. Perhaps we're missing philosophy as a popular form, and that the condition of possibility for that to be a reality is, quote unquote, according to Marx, the people must be taught to be terrified of itself in order to give it courage. And I think, again, when it comes to the history of Marxism and the history of communism as a failed political project, and stated otherwise, to relate to and reflect on the fact that we live in a very liberal hedonistic world, that maybe the missing ingredient here is the confrontation with the fear of our own social body. And that's the truth, that we must fear how terrifying we can be collectively in order to give us courage to confront the realities that we need to confront. And here, of course, we have now clear historical evidence of the horrors and the terrors that the collective human social body can um, can exert over itself when it comes to world wars, when it comes to the Holocaust, when it comes to the Cold War, when it comes to nuclear annihilation, when it comes to genocide, slavery, and so forth. So this is what we're dealing with. It's obviously a tremendously difficult problem. It's obviously, I think, still a problem that's very much with us. So, in a way, it might be slightly different than the way Marx is thinking about it and the social reality that Marx is responding to. But certainly, the main tensions and antagonisms that Marx is pointing out to us are still with us. And so, in that spirit, I would agree with the Marxist theorist Chris Cutrone when he says that he's not trying to bring us into the 19th century. That is, Cutrone is not trying to bring us into the 19th century, but rather that we have not left the 19th century in a certain way. I am sort of increasingly of the mind that what the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm suggests about the short 20th century, that is, the 20th century from World War I to the end of the Cold War, is actually something where we actually failed to lift ourselves, let's say, out of the 19th century and the problems of the 19th century. And there's huge questions there about how would Marx think actually about the 20th century, and how would Marx respond to the failures of the Marxist International, and how would Marx respond to World War One and the realities of World War One, and how would Marx respond to the unconscious, and how would Marx respond, to all of these things that we now have a full historical retroactive awareness of. So there's a huge challenge there, and I think that that's again kind of one of the reasons why I think this course is going to be so important. So I'll reiterate, this was the first part of covering the introduction of the critique of the philosophy of right. I'll reiterate that this was more obviously of a theological and a religious critique, and that in the next video we'll be going more into Marx's political critique, and again that the critique of the philosophy of right was only released as an introduction in Marx's time, that the full book wasn't available until 1920s after the Russian Revolution, and that I think what we're going to be able to explore in the class is a deep dive of the actual text of the critique of the philosophy of right, which probably gets overlooked in regards to the introduction. And I think what we're going to be able to find if we go into this text is we are going to be able to find that Marx has a very antagonistic relationship with Hegel, and that yes, Marx is trying to turn Hegel on his head in a way, and specifically in regards to his system in the philosophy of right. And I'm interested in what the dialectic of this tension is, and that might have huge ramifications for how we think about religion and politics, and that might have huge ramifications for how we think about structure and post-structure, to get into distinctions that become salient in postmodernity, and specifically the tensions that we see between a Lacan and a Deleuze, for example, or the tensions we might see between a deconstructive theology and a psychoanalytic theology, for example, which are something we covered in the Christian atheism course. So I'll leave it there. That's been the critique of the philosophy of right. I will make a second video, which will cover the second part. And then I will also just reemphasize that this is all a part of a course at Philosophy Portal, which will be going on all year. And that course will be offering seminars on the early writings of Karl Marx. We start with the critique of the philosophy of right. And that critique will be on Sunday, May 11th. And this course is open, meaning you can join anytime. And to get involved, just visit philosophyportal.online, and I hope to see you in class.